late August 1922. I cannot be certain. She sustained a lot of injuries, a lot of bleeding. Dr. Clarkson glanced down, regret on his face. I am sure you did all you could, Isabel Crawley replied, but her words trailed off as she glanced to Milo. Unconscious but breathing, her face and body had taken a battering. It was a miracle, by all accounts, that she had not plunged to her death. Milo had, however, been left dangling over the side of the church spire until the transmitter's wire broke and she landed on the edge of the church roof. That was what the raised voices downstairs were trying to establish, emotional voices, guilt-ridden ones. Is what we thought. Lost, said Dr. Clarkson. Though I will only talk to Thomas Barrow if he is, as you say, legal next of kin. Isabel Crawley looked across to Milo again. Can you at least tell me that she will be well, apart from the cuts and bruises? Dr. Clarkson looked over too. I believe she will, he told her. Just some good rest and she should be right as rain. Does she had somewhere to stay here? Mrs. Crawley looked back to her. Here, she said, simply. I have gathered together her paperwork. It was all over the place. Work she was doing for the university, no doubt. Dr. Clarkson took a few steps towards Milo and glanced at the papers. Complicated mathematics, I must say, he told her. She has her degree now, does she not? And under Rutherford gaining her doctorate. That is some achievement for a young woman of her. He broke off and they both looked at the door. I heard what you said, Thomas told Clarkson. I can infer what you mean by lost, Dr. Clarkson. His face was grim, determined, and Mrs. Crawley considered that it looked like he had not slept in days. Mrs. Crawley, Clarkson began, but Thomas stepped into Milo's room and, without taking his eyes from her, asked Mrs. Crawley to close the door, which she did, and stood behind it. I have no idea who did this to her, Thomas began. He turned his head sharply to the doctor, and glanced to Isabel Crawley. Not I, though we are married. Our marriage is, shall we say, celibate. He looked between Dr. and Mrs. Crawley. Will you be able to just say that she slipped and she injured herself, nothing more? No one needs to know, Mr. Barrow, Dr. Clarkson assured him. And please, consider me a confidant if do discover something. She is a dear girl, and with how she is, Thomas gave a quizzical look to the doctor. Mr. Ashby, her father, Thomas told them, took me Lucina to his family doctor, in Manchester. He did some tests, and recommend her for an institution. It would be best for her, he was told. Think of the girl she cannot help in the world. And Mr. Ashby ignored him, and the subsequent letter he sent, saying he had sought a second opinion, made him angry. He looked across to Milo, casting an angry gaze. Ernest told me, he choked, then swallowed. Her brother said, that his father was angry for a long time. Look at her, he said of his father. She is just like you, when you were a child, into everything. But she is a girl. And so their father decided to allow me Lucina to do what Ernest had done, educate her as he had Ernest, give her the same opportunities. Mr. Ashby was so proud of her, especially when she gave her presentation to the academics that were once her brothers, and outstrip him, too. Thomas stopped when he felt Mrs. Crawley's hand on his forearm. And when he died, you took on the mantle of Ernest, she told him, quietly. You continued to protect her where her brother and her father could no longer protect her. Thomas hesitated. I admit, when we married, I did look into such things, considering the way her mind works, to help her. There are institutions, Dr. Clarkson told him, cold, grey places, where the nurses kick and hit the patients for sport. Thomas scorned. You have a low opinion of institutions, said Dr. Clarkson, severely. They have come a long way since the time of Victoria. But Thomas Barrow wasn't listening. He turned away from them both, bringing his arms to his head, silent tears slipping down his cheeks. Dr. Clarkson glanced to Mrs. Crawley, and they waited for Thomas, allowing him time and space to think, to talk. But I didn't, don't you see? He was there, and Thomas thought to Edna Braithwaite's words, all her arrogance and swagger gone, motivated to confide in Thomas to relieve her own conscience, and she was trying to tell Lady Mary, trying to tell me?" He bunched up his fist and put it to his forehead. When she couldn't explain how she was on the gallery, how she was in Lady Mary's room. He turned his anguished face to them. "She was anxious about her house, Mrs. Crawley. There was a document, a lease, that your son had drawn up for her," Thomas continued. "She was distressed about it." He looked across to Clarkson, and back to Milo, the tears beginning again. "Take heart, Mr. Barrow," Mrs. Crawley told him. "Milo is in possession of that lease now." And she crossed to where the papers were, handing them to him. "She would want to know they are safe, and she would know they would be safe with you," she told Thomas, and he reluctantly took them from her hands, having first given her a doubtful look. Then, he put them onto the small table beside Milo, and crouched so that he was level with her. She looked so peaceful, Thomas considered. Peaceful, but injured, and all for the sake of the transmitter, which people had told her must come down, which both the Dowager and Lady Mary had threatened to have taken down before her. Why hadn't he stuck up for her then, knowing that the pulling down of the transmitter would have upset her? Thomas reached for her hands, and in her sleep, Milo curled her fingers around his. He didn't know, of course, not until Rutherford had told him. But he had fallen into the same trap as the rest of them, making life difficult for the girl because she was different. "Let's leave him with her," Dr. Clarkson said quietly to Mrs. Crawley, and she opened the door quietly, holding it open for him, as Thomas bowed his head and rested his forehead on the edge of Milo's bed. 88,888,888 Lord Grantham was in the sitting room when Mrs. Crawley got downstairs. James Kent, the footman, was standing, as white as a sheet, near the window. Beside him sat Margaret Jameson, Milo's grandmother, beside Violet Crawley. All three looked to her when she entered, followed by Dr. Clarkson. "I cannot pretend to understand what it is that you are saying," said Margaret Jameson continued, as Mrs. Crawley smiled to them. "But what I do know, as her grandmother, is that I am as proud as ever I can be." She stood up and crossed the floor, holding out a hand to Mrs. Crawley. "I can see you have cared for her well, and so my worries are lessened," she added. "Were that I was in the position to move her back home with me. She was born at Castle Daphne, you know." She stepped back, and looked to Violet Crawley. "But of course, you knew that. It was you who answered my letter when I told of dear Ernest and his degree in physics, and his practical application in need of a commission." She glanced to Lord Grantham. "You were good to choose him, over any others. He was an extraordinarily gifted young man, whose loss, like so many others, is sorely felt." "What is it you will do?" Mrs. Crawley asked Margaret Jameson. "Now you are in England, I mean." "Andrew had family in Scotland, but no longer. I have a cousin in Bedfordshire, and we have a connection with Galileo. Of course." She said that she will have us. "You are more than welcome to stay at Downton for as long as you wish," Lord Grantham told her. But Mrs. Jameson shook her head. "I need to rebuild. My cousin has import and export links with the continent, which is just getting going. I have a little for the sale of the whiskey business, nowhere near as much as it is really worth, though, due to the situation in Ireland." Mrs. Jameson inhaled deeply. "Though Isabella and Richard have already exchanged letters, so I believe they wish to marry. As for Helen, her mathematical and business skills are a wonder. She will do well whatever she chooses to do." Margaret Jameson looked across to the doctor. "And how is she?" "My granddaughter." Dr. Clarkson glanced to Mrs. Crawley. "I won't lie to you, Mrs. Jameson," and he looked to the Dowager Countess and Lord Grantham. "She is rather seriously hurt. If, as you say, she slipped at the top of the spire, which caused her to fall, that transmitter of hers saved her life. But she did hit the roof of the church with some force." "My God!" exclaimed Lord Grantham, and turned to Jimmy. "There is a 20-something young woman unconscious upstairs, and I want to know exactly how you are involved." Jimmy looked to Lord Grantham. "Why died?" "Your lordship," he replied, "I was merely on the way to the village. I saw someone on top of the church." Jimmy felt his heart beat faster. "I saw it was Milo, I mean, Miss Ashby," he went on, "so I called up for her. Then, because it was raining and thundering, and she looked to be in difficulty." He looked at everyone's intent faces, and plunged on. So I left the bike and the shopping and I climbed up the stairs. It was when I got to level with the roof that she fell past me. Jimmy inhaled, so I called for help, and Mr. Hall from the grocer's heard me and we together got her down. Well, said Lord Grantham, it looks as if you did her good turn. Had you not, she might have perished overnight. He stopped, and looked where Jimmy was looking. A figure was at the doorway. It's Milo, your lordship, Thomas Barrow told him. He was shaking, and looked as pale as paper. But he swallowed and drew himself upright. And she's not 20-something, she's 18. 18. Lord Grantham exclaimed. I forget how young she is, considering all she has done. Then he turned to his family. And that we might have had something to do with it, Robert Crawley said, sternly. Any of us, he added, looking to Edith and Mary and Rose, who were sitting on the opposite settee. I want you to look into yourselves and wonder if you did anything, said anything, anything at all, that caused this young woman to act as she did. Because if you did, you have done her a grave disservice. A moment of awkward silence fell over the people in the sitting room. Lord Grantham looked away, knowing that he had overheard some high-handed things. They needed to be told leadership was only effective with compassion and humanity. You have my gratitude, Violet, Mrs. Jameson told the Dowager, which broke the spell of accusation. For your care of my granddaughter. Violet Crawley scoffed in the way that people do when they want to make light of an obligation fulfilled. I wouldn't go that far, she replied. Miss Ashby is a very singular young lady of whom I can only expect great things in the future. Though where she will be to achieve those things, does anybody know? It was typical Dowager Countess, to say out loud what other people may be thinking. It was good to face these things head on. She had always considered there was business to do with her home. She had a room next to the housekeeper's sitting room, and there was her work in Cambridge, where she was being cared for by the professor under whom she was studying. What was the answer going to be? Violet, for one, was not getting any younger, and would have liked to have an answer, preferably by the end of the evening. And you are correct in expecting those, came the stentorian voice in the hall. Professor Sir Ernest Rutherford had let himself into Crawley House the back way, and was now filling the space where Thomas had just been. Proudly, May and I have overseen the care of Ashby. She is a daughter to us, as well as my student. Sir Rutherford. Cora Crawley exclaimed. It is a pleasure to see you again, though not under these circumstances. And Ashby is, well, alive, at least, Lord Grantham told the man. And Thomas Barrow felt his heart surge for the first time in nearly a week as Ernest Rutherford insisted that Milo come back to Christ's College, to the Cavendish, to continue with her work. It is no mean thing to say we would be months behind had it not been for Ashby. She has a mind equal to that of her brother and practical skill equal to that of Blackett, though, don't tell him I told you that. Blackett, Thomas thought, moving back up the stairs. But his mind would not fix on his intermittent lover now, but was fixed on the lease on the Ashby house, and what he needed to do to secure it for Milo once and for all. 88,888,888. The conversation in the empty woodshed just beyond the generator building was held in the Irish tongue and, as it was, between Jack Prue, not his real name as we have said before, and Tom Branson, which was, unfortunately for him, it was unfortunate, because every militant Republican in the new Free State knew it, and knew him for what he was, a traitor. Arrogance, Jack Prue had considered, arrogance and ignorance, borne on by fear and greed. It was how the mighty fell, every time. For he knew exactly what Tom Branson was about when he had had sex with Lucina Ashby, and that was, under Irish law, between an Irish woman and an Irishman, a declaration that they were, well, if not wed, legally connected. Every Irish person knew the ancient laws, more ancient even than any remnant of Roman law threading their way through the laws of Britain, laid down by the Druid, the ancient class of learned before St. John's Gospel word was brought to the nation. It was now, through the sweat of those he had abandoned, the deaths of the many, that Tom Branson had been compelled to act, for both fear and greed. Additionally, he had allied himself to the Crawley family, and in doing so, abandoned forever the cause, and the mission, that he had sworn he would carry out. He was a sunny traitor, a man turned coat against his Irish brethren, and instead, supporting with dogged loyalty the old regime of unity under Britain. And for what? The price of comfort and the opportunity for greed. The British upper-class mentality had certainly written to his mind and made him forget Ireland. And, more importantly, he had forgotten the vow he had taken, over his father's body on the steps of the post office, to be one of many, under the guise of seeking work, acting as a sleeper cell, waiting to be called on in the event of an uprising, and in the meantime, carry out as many acts of civil disobedience against the ruling classes as he could. Tom Branson had a perfect position as the chauffeur at Downton, access to transportation, and opportunities to eavesdrop, or cause as much disruption and destabilization as he could. He had begun so well, with the inky soup and the plan to enlist in the army, and call out in defiance. But his head had been turned by a pretty colleen, and his soul had been corrupted by money as well as desire. The Republican Army never forgot, and never forgave. There was a child conceived through your unity, Jack Prue told him, though she lost it from the fall. He turned quickly to Tom Branson, as quickly as one might be if he was carrying a weapon he wanted to use, and Prue was, in a way. He pushed the white lily flower into Tom Branson's hand, too quick for the man to resist, and stepped away. Branson looked down in horror. "We are Legion," he told him, "and we will not be crossed." And Jack Prue turned and left Tom Branson alone in the dusklight, clutching the grave, potent symbol, which Prue knew Branson understood the significance of, that he was now a marked man.